Hello, okay then. So this video, or the next two videos actually, are going to be about the factions and the divisions within the Democrat Party. And these are the formal factions who form little groups of Democrats in Congress. They call them caucuses, just to confuse you. Okay, so there are, amongst the Democrats, some very broad areas of agreement within this party. They generally have a positive view of the government and tend to support big government programmes. They tend to be socially liberal. They often support gay marriage, a woman's right to have an abortion, and other kind of social liberal issues. They do tend to be more supportive of gun control. That doesn't mean they want to get rid of guns. They just want to have more control over firearms. They tend to support welfare programs. And finally, they are often classed as being liberal or progressive. So these are some broad areas of agreement among Democrats, and they tend to agree tend to agree with these things to a greater or lesser extent. Now, there's three main factions within the Democrat Party in Congress. On the left of the party, you've got what's known as the progressive left. In the middle, you've got what's known as the DLC, or often is known as the New Democrat Coalition. And on the right of the Democrat Party, and probably towards the centre of American politics, you've got what's known as the Blue Dog Democrats. These are your conservative Democrats. So let's discuss the progressive left then. So their general views are that they tend to celebrate the past achievements of the Democrats, in particular civil rights and the New Deal of FDR and the New Frontier, I suppose, of John F. Kennedy and the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. They tend to support extending healthcare coverage, and many of them felt that Obamacare was a bit too weak and wishy-washy and they want to go further on healthcare. They do tend to support restricting firearms. They're the most supportive, I suppose, of laws to restrict firearms. They do support increasing the minimum wage. They do support immigration reform. And they tend to support higher taxation for the most wealthy in American society as well. And finally, this group tends to be the most supportive of LGBT rights, women's rights, that kind of social liberal agenda. So these are some broad areas of agreement for the progressive left. Now, how strong they are within the Democrat Party? Well, they are the largest caucus within the Congressional Democrats. 95 House members formally are part of this group. They've also got one senator who's a formal member, who's Bernie Sanders. And of course, Bernie Sanders gained 13 million votes of ordinary people in the 2016 primaries, which might suggest that a lot of Democrat grassroots supporters, might be up with the progressive left end of the party, I suppose. And originally, Nancy Pelosi, the current speaker, was a co-founder of this group, although she's no longer actually within the progressive left. But before her days, I suppose, in the leadership of the Democrat Party, she was actually a founder of this particular group. Okay, so this group then, the chairwoman of this caucus is this lady, Pramila Jayapal, of Washington State. And this is some of the things which she supports. So she supports a living wage. She supports universal healthcare, a bit like the UK's NHS. She supports free tuition at public colleges and universities. She opposed the USA supporting Saudi Arabia's coalition against Yemen. She also supports cutting the military budget as well. She's also quite pro-Israel as well, I noticed, looking at some of her policy stances. The whip of the progressive left, notice again, they're almost like parties within parties, aren't they? The fact you've got a chair and you've got a whip within the progressive left caucus. It reminds you a little bit of the ERG group within the Conservative Party in the UK. Again, That's a faction, isn't it, where they have these sorts of things. In America, it's quite common, less so in Britain. Anyway, this lady is the whip of the Progressive Caucus, and again, very similar things to Pramila Jayapal. Living wage, healthcare, affordable housing. She's a bit more anti-Israel than her colleague. She denounced Israel's settlement policy, for example. And she's actually in the infrastructure bill, which has just passed through Congress today, the day of making this recording, November 2021. There were 6 Democrats who voted against the Infrastructure Act, and one of them was Ilhan Omar. And it's because it wasn't radical enough, it wasn't big enough. So she voted against it, along with 6 others. I noticed her colleague, Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, did not vote against it. She was also the target quite a lot of Donald Trump as well. Donald Trump went to Minnesota a couple of times and said that she had to go home and things like that. So she was the target of Donald Trump's anger as well. Okay then, the second group, which hopefully should get time to go to on this video, is the Democrat Leadership Council, otherwise or sometimes known as the New Democrat Coalition. Okay, they were formed, it's a bit like with New Labour in Britain. They were formed following Reagan's years in power, which were disastrous for the Democrat Party. And this group described themselves as moderates. They believe in responsible economics with balanced budgets. Many of them supported, for example, George Bush's tax cuts in the 2000s. They tend to support Obamacare. Many in this group think Obamacare is about right. It's not too radical, and it does actually increase healthcare coverage. So this group are perhaps most supportive of Obamacare and thought it was on the right kind of lines, generally speaking. They do support some restrictions on guns, and they do tend to be pro-choice. They support LGBT rights as well. So again, that's social liberalism from this group. They are quite strong on law and order. You know, they do want some kind of immigration reform, but they are quite strong on law and order. Many in this group support the death penalty, for example. And they tend to be more hawkish on foreign policy. That doesn't mean they've grown beaks and things. What that means is that this group tend to be most supportive using the military abroad to meet American aims. For example, most of this group supported the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, which George W. Bush spearheaded, for example. Okay, how strong are they in the Democrat Party? Well, they're the second largest faction. They were the largest faction until 2020. They lost some House members in the 2020 election, so now they're down to 93. So they're about equal, I suppose, aren't they, with the progressive left, really. The fact they lost some seats as well is not surprising, because they tend to be slightly more conservative. Obviously, when the Democrats are doing well, they take seats off Republicans, and they're obviously quite conservative seats. And of course, when the Democrats do less well, then the first seats which flip back to the Republicans. So the fact they lost a couple of seats, or 10 seats, they were probably slightly more conservative seats, ones which Republicans were probably aiming at. Hillary and President Bill Clinton were both in this faction. Bill Clinton was one of the founders of this faction. Hillary, of course, won the 2016 primaries. So when I said before how, 13 million people voted for Bernie Sanders, which might suggest the grassroots of the Democrats were kind of on the progressive left side, well, actually, Hillary Clinton, of course, won those primaries, which might suggest that more Democrat grassroots people are on this middle ground. And again, the fact that Joe Biden won the primaries in 2020, and obviously then the presidency, again might suggest that either the grassroots Democrat voters are more in line with this kind of moderate group, or it might suggest they're more pragmatic and wanted to make sure they defeated Donald Trump. Okay, Barack Obama as well, he told the New Democrat Coalition in Congress that he was a pro-growth Democrat, whatever that means, which has kind of indicated that perhaps he too identifies himself with this moderate part of the party. Okay, I'm going to call that a day on this particular video because I'm running out of time. and I'll do part 2 on the new the Blue Dog Democrats in a few minutes' time.